They laughed at her diminutive frame, calling her tiny and questioning why the Special Forces even bothered including her in selection training. But when disaster struck and their 6'3" commander lay critically wounded in hostile territory, Private First Class Sarah Mitchell and her supposedly inferior physical strength became their only hope for survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's training grounds as PFC Sarah Mitchell adjusted the straps on her rucksack. Around her, the Special Forces Qualification Course buzzed with activity as instructors prepared the candidates for another day of grueling assessment. Massive men with shoulders like oak trees dominated the assembly area, their imposing frames radiating confidence and physical power. And then there was her, standing 5'4" and weighing just 125 pounds, looking almost comically small compared to the hulking specimens surrounding her. Sarah had been fighting to earn her place in Special Forces training for 3 years now, ever since policy changes had opened the door for women to attempt qualification. She'd battled bureaucracy, skepticism, and outright hostility to even reach this point. Most of the male candidates referred to her as the mascot, or worse, Mitchell's mistake, a reference to the commanding officer who had approved her application. Sarah had been at the top of her class in basic combat training and advanced individual training, earning distinguished graduate status and setting records in several tactical assessments. She'd completed Ranger School with honors, earning respect from instructors who initially doubted her capabilities. But somehow, those accomplishments seemed to carry less weight than the fact that she couldn't bench press 300 pounds or tower over everyone in the room. The physical disparities were obvious, but Sarah knew that Special Forces required more than raw strength. It demanded intelligence, adaptability, and a level of mental toughness that couldn't be measured on a scale or with a tape measure. "Hey, Tiny," called out Staff Sergeant Brad Collins as he strutted past in full kit, massive arms swinging at his sides. "Still thinking you can hang with the big boys? They've got a nice desk job waiting for you back at headquarters." His buddies snickered at the joke, which had grown stale months ago, but apparently never got old for them. Sarah didn't respond. She learned that engaging with Collins and his crew only encouraged more of their juvenile behavior. Instead, she focused on her pre-assessment preparation, checking every item in her pack with the same meticulous attention she'd given to mission-critical equipment during her deployments to Iraq and Syria as an intelligence specialist. The truth was, she loved the challenge of Special Forces training. It pushed her to her absolute limits physically, but it also rewarded the skills she excelled at: problem-solving, tactical thinking, and an uncanny ability to keep functioning under extreme stress when others started making mistakes. While the bigger candidates relied on brute strength to power through obstacles, Sarah had to develop creative approaches and technical expertise that often proved more efficient. But those advantages meant nothing to the course instructors, who measured success by how many pull-ups you could do or how quickly you could carry a 240-pound dummy across uneven terrain. It was a frustrating lesson in how institutions often valued appearance over substance, conventional metrics over actual capability. Master Sergeant James Ramirez emerged from the command post, his attention focused on the day's assessment course, a 30-mile land navigation exercise through the swamps and dense forests surrounding the training area, carrying 80-pound packs while locating a series of checkpoints with increasing difficulty. It was the kind of high-stress assessment that separated the truly capable from those who merely looked the part. "Mitchell," Ramirez called out without looking in her direction, "you'll be running Observer today. Stay with Team 3 and document their performance." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Observer. It was military speak for stay out of the way and don't interfere with the real candidates.
Sarah had been assigned the same support role for the past 3 weeks, despite having demonstrated superior navigation skills during the preliminary assessments. Her record from previous training included perfect scores on land navigation exercises that other candidates had failed, identifying patterns and terrain features that others missed, and completing courses that required precision movement in spaces where being detected meant automatic failure. But none of that seemed to matter here. What mattered was that she was small, female, and didn't fit the traditional image of a Special Forces operator. She didn't have the massive frame that could carry wounded comrades effortlessly, couldn't hump the heaviest weapon systems without strain, and would never physically intimidate enemies through sheer size. "Understood, sir," Sarah replied, though her jaw tightened with familiar frustration. She watched as Team 3 completed their briefings, their confident swagger reflecting their status as the course's premier candidates. They were good soldiers, she had to admit, but most of their confidence came from years of being the biggest and strongest in any room they entered. They'd never had to compensate for physical limitations, never had to innovate when standard approaches weren't feasible, never had to win through superior tactics because brute force wasn't an option. In Sarah's experience, those who never faced real limitations often developed blind spots that could prove fatal in actual combat situations. Sergeant Lisa Wong approached Sarah, tablet in hand and a sympathetic expression on her face. Lisa was one of the few people on base who treated Sarah with the respect her record deserved. Having served alongside her during a deployment where Sarah's intelligence analysis had saved their patrol from an ambush, she understood the value of cognitive skills and tactical awareness in combat situations. "Another observer role?" Lisa observed, glancing at the assignment order on her tablet. "They're really not utilizing your capabilities, Mitchell." Sarah shrugged, but her frustration was evident. The Army has certain ideas about what constitutes an effective operator. Apparently, size and upper body strength are more important than tactical thinking and problem-solving skills. "The guys don't know what they're talking about," Lisa said quietly, checking to make sure they weren't overheard. "I've seen you outperform candidates twice your size when it comes to actual mission execution. Remember that time in Syria when you figured out the insurgent communication pattern when none of the intel officers could crack it?" The memory was both painful and proud for Sarah. A reconnaissance team had been pinned down in an urban environment, surrounded by enemy forces using an encrypted communication system to coordinate their movements. The team was running low on ammunition and taking casualties with no clear extraction path. Sarah had volunteered to analyze the communications, identifying patterns that revealed a 3-minute gap in coverage on the southern approach. The extraction had to take precise timing and perfect execution, but she'd created a window of opportunity that got everyone home alive. It wasn't about physical strength. It was about seeing patterns that others missed and having the confidence to act on that intelligence under extreme pressure. "That was different," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Combat situations require different considerations." "Does it?" Lisa challenged. "Because from what I've seen, the skills that make you effective in actual combat would be just as valuable in Special Forces as the ability to carry a heavy pack. But nobody wants to admit that the little woman might actually bring something essential to the table." Through the command post's open doors, they could see the assessment beginning. The candidates shouldered their massive packs and headed toward the starting line, their movements powerful and confident despite the weight. Radio chatter filled the communication frequencies as the instructors reported their positions, their voices professional but tinged with the excitement of the chase. This was their element, the kind of physical challenge that showcased raw strength and endurance. Sarah checked her own much lighter observer pack and began her preparations to follow Team 3.
Her role was strictly to document their performance, successes and failures, decision points and team dynamics, without offering any input or assistance. She was essentially a walking camera, recording but not participating in the assessment that would determine who advanced to the next phase of selection. As she moved toward the starting area, Sarah could hear the course instructors setting up increasingly challenging scenarios for the candidates. The checkpoints would become more difficult to locate as the day progressed, with limited clues and deliberate misdirection designed to test both navigational skills and decision-making under pressure. It was good training, she acknowledged, but it also highlighted the limitations of relying exclusively on physical prowess for mission success. The strongest candidate in the world was useless if he couldn't find the objective or identify the critical intelligence that would determine mission success or failure. The radio crackled with updates from the assessment, candidates reporting their progress through the early checkpoints, instructors monitoring their movements through hidden observation posts, and generally smooth operations that confirmed everyone's assumptions about how Special Forces selection should work. Sarah maintained her position with Team 3, documenting their progress and feeling increasingly like an expensive camera rather than a qualified soldier with valuable skills to contribute. But as the morning progressed, something in the team dynamics began to change. The assessment controllers were pushing the candidates toward more challenging terrain, places where their size and strength might become disadvantages rather than assets. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the navigational decisions being made. Her combat experience automatically analyzing the terrain and route choices being selected by Team 3's leader, Captain Jason Rivers. The forest and swampland where the exercise was taking place were notorious for disorienting even experienced navigators. Sarah had studied the area extensively during her preparation for the course, noting the subtle terrain features, misleading landmarks, and optical illusions that could turn routine land navigation into a tactical nightmare. The environment was beautiful but unforgiving, the kind of place where intelligence and careful observation mattered more than physical strength. Sarah noticed Captain Rivers making subtle navigational errors, confusing similar ridgelines and gradually leading his team off course. The mistakes were small at first, easily correctable if identified quickly, but they were compounding with each decision point. All units, be advised, we're seeing weather deterioration in sectors 4 and 5. Came the voice of the exercise controller. Thunderstorms developing with potential for flash flooding in low-lying areas. Adjust movement plans accordingly. Sarah checked her own weather app and frowned. The conditions were changing faster than predicted, with a storm system moving in that threatened to turn the training exercise into something more serious. She'd seen similar patterns during deployments, where environmental conditions could shift from manageable to life-threatening in minutes. Team 3 continued its movement, maintaining a punishing pace, despite the increasingly obvious signs that they were heading in the wrong direction. Sarah kept her observations to herself, documenting the team's performance while noting the growing gap between their plotted position and their actual location on the map. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the nature of respect and recognition in military operations. She'd earned her credentials in some of the most demanding environments possible, proving her value under conditions where failure meant death. Somehow those accomplishments counted for less than being able to carry a 240-pound man up a hill without breaking stride. It was a frustrating lesson in how institutions often valued traditional metrics over actual performance, conventional appearance over demonstrable capability. The radio chatter was becoming more tense as the weather continued to deteriorate. What had started as a routine assessment exercise was beginning to reveal the limitations of relying exclusively on physical prowess for mission success. Sarah sensed that the day was about to become much more interesting, though she had no idea just how dramatically everything was about to change.
The deteriorating weather was beginning to transform what should have been a challenging but manageable training exercise into something far more dangerous. Sarah watched from her position as heavy rain began to fall through the forest canopy, reducing visibility and creating the kind of conditions that separated experienced operators from those who merely looked the part. The radio chatter from Team 3 was becoming increasingly tense as they encountered flooded terrain and realized they weren't where their map indicated they should be. "Command, this is Team 3 Actual. Requesting confirmation of our position relative to checkpoint Delta. Terrain features aren't matching our map coordinates." The response from Master Sergeant Ramirez revealed nothing about the team's navigational error. "Team 3, this is Command. Continue with your current bearing and report when you reach the next identifiable landmark." Sarah listened to the exchange with growing concern. She'd navigated these forests countless times during her preparation for the course, and she recognized the signs of a team that was not just slightly off course, but potentially heading into dangerous territory. The area to their north contained a series of ravines that would be filling rapidly with the heavy rainfall, creating potential flash flood conditions. From her position slightly behind the team, she could see the increasing frustration among the members as they pushed through increasingly difficult terrain without finding their expected checkpoints. Captain Rivers was maintaining a confident facade, but his frequent consultations with his map and compass betrayed his growing uncertainty. Sarah maintained her role of silent observer, taking notes on the team's decision-making process while struggling with the professional dilemma of watching trained soldiers make potentially dangerous mistakes without offering correction. The exercise was designed to test their ability to overcome challenges independently, but the rapidly deteriorating weather was creating conditions beyond the scope of a normal assessment. "Mitchell, are you monitoring the weather data?" came Master Sergeant Ramirez's voice over the command frequency. His tone suggested he was beginning to realize that the exercise might need to be called off if conditions continued to deteriorate. "Affirmative, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm seeing rapid development of convective activity with rainfall rates exceeding 2 inches per hour in some cells. The terrain ahead of Team 3 contains a series of ravines that may be experiencing flash flooding." There was a pause before Ramirez's response, and Sarah could imagine him consulting with the meteorology team and trying to decide whether to abort what was supposed to be a showcase assessment for the course's top candidates. Calling off the exercise would be embarrassing, but continuing in dangerous conditions could be catastrophic. "All units, this is command. Weather conditions are deteriorating beyond acceptable parameters. Begin consolidating at your current positions and prepare for extraction. Emergency rendezvous points are being transmitted to your GPS units." The radio immediately filled with acknowledgments from the various teams scattered throughout the training area. But as Team 3 attempted to plot their route to the designated extraction point, the challenges became apparent. Captain Rivers was studying his map with increasing frustration, his confident demeanor beginning to crack as he realized they weren't where they thought they were. "Command, Team 3. Unable to confirm current position relative to extraction coordinates. Requesting assistance with location verification," Rivers transmitted, his voice tight with professional embarrassment. Sarah found herself unconsciously moving closer, her training and experience automatically analyzing the map and terrain features around them. She could pinpoint their exact location based on subtle landscape cues that the others had missed. A distinctive rock formation to their east, the specific pattern of vegetation changes that indicated an old creek bed, the slight elevation change that separated this section of forest from similar-looking areas nearby. "Team 3, maintain current position and activate emergency beacon," came the response from command. "We're triangulating your location now."
Sarah knew that waiting for technological solutions while the weather continued to deteriorate was potentially dangerous. The ravine system to their north was already showing signs of increased water flow, and the paths to several possible extraction points would soon be cut off by rising water levels. "Sir," Sarah said, breaking protocol by addressing Rivers directly instead of maintaining her observer role, "I believe I can identify our position based on terrain features." She pointed to specific landmarks that corresponded to locations on their map, explaining the navigational errors that had led them astray and outlining the fastest route to the nearest extraction point. Rivers looked at her with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Mitchell, you're here to observe, not participate. We'll handle our own navigation." The rebuke stung, but Sarah wasn't entirely surprised. She'd offered tactical input based on superior knowledge of the terrain and demonstrable expertise in land navigation, but her assistance wasn't wanted. The fact that she was the smallest person in the group apparently disqualified her from having anything useful to contribute to the situation. 20 minutes later, the weather had worsened to the point where even the most optimistic assessment couldn't ignore the danger. The rain was falling in sheets now, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters and turning the forest floor into a treacherous mix of mud and standing water. Command had ordered all teams to move to high ground and wait for helicopter extraction, but Team 3 was still struggling to determine their exact position and the best route to safety. "All teams, be advised," came a new voice on the command frequency. Colonel William Davidson, the commanding officer of the entire Special Forces training program. "We have reports of flash flooding throughout the training area. Multiple extraction points are now compromised. Helicopter assets are inbound, but experiencing delays due to weather conditions." The situation was transforming from a challenging training exercise into a genuine emergency. Sarah watched as Team 3 huddled around their map, debating route options while the water around their boots continued to rise. The standard extraction points would require crossing terrain that was likely already flooded, but attempting to reach higher ground without a clear understanding of their location risked leading them into even greater danger. Sarah made a decision that went against every protocol she'd been taught. She approached the team again, this time with her own map marked with their precise location and 3 potential routes to safety. "Captain Rivers," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we're here." She pointed to a specific location on the map. "The standard extraction points are compromised by flooding, but there's a ridgeline 2 kilometers to our southeast that offers both elevation and a suitable landing zone for helicopter extraction." Rivers looked at her with renewed irritation, but Staff Sergeant Collins interrupted before he could dismiss her again. "Sir, I think she's right," Collins said, comparing Sarah's marked map to their own. "These terrain features match what we're seeing, and her proposed route keeps us above the floodplain." It was a surprising intervention from someone who had been one of her most vocal critics, but Sarah recognized the shift that occurred when genuine danger replaced training scenarios. Suddenly, capability mattered more than appearance, and results trumped tradition. Rivers hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining his authority and accepting help from an unexpected source. Before he could decide, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "All units, be advised," came Colonel Davidson's voice, tension evident in every word. "We have a man down. Colonel Marcus Taylor has been injured during movement to high ground. His team reports a severe fall with suspected spinal injuries and loss of consciousness. Current position is approximately 2 kilometers north of Checkpoint Echo, in an area with rapidly rising water levels." The announcement sent a shock through Team 3. Colonel Taylor was not only the commanding officer of the entire Special Forces group, but also one of the most respected operators in the community, a legend who had served in every major conflict of the past 20 years and personally trained many of the men now searching for him. "Command, this is Team 3, Rivers transmitted immediately.
"What is our role in the search and rescue operation?" The response was quick and direct. "Team 3, you are closest to Colonel Taylor's last known position. Proceed immediately to these coordinates and render aid. Be advised, the terrain between your position and his location is experiencing significant flooding. Exercise extreme caution." The coordinates appeared on their GPS units, and Sarah immediately plotted them on her map. The location was in the heart of the ravine system she had been concerned about, an area that would be among the most dangerous on the entire training range during flash flood conditions. "Sir, the direct route to those coordinates crosses 3 separate drainage channels that will be carrying heavy water flow," Sarah said, pointing to the map. "But there's an alternate approach along this ridgeline that keeps us above the floodplain until we're within 500 meters of his position." This time Rivers didn't hesitate. "Mitchell, you've demonstrated superior knowledge of this terrain. Take point and get us to the Colonel's position by the safest route possible." The change in status was immediate and dramatic. Sarah went from ignored observer to essential navigator in the space of a single transmission. The team fell in behind her as she led them along the ridgeline, moving with the confidence of someone who had studied every contour of the landscape in preparation for exactly this kind of situation. The rain continued to fall in torrents, turning the forest into a chaotic maze of flowing water and unstable ground. Through gaps in the trees, they could see that the lower elevations were already transformed into raging rivers, carrying debris and carving new channels through the landscape. The decision to take the higher route was proving critical to their survival, let alone their mission success. "How did you know about this ridgeline?" Collins asked as they moved, his earlier disdain replaced by genuine curiosity. "It's not marked as a primary movement route on any of the standard maps." "I studied the historical flood patterns for this area," Sarah replied without breaking stride. "This ridge has remained above water level during every major flood event in the past 50 years. The standard routes follow terrain features that are easier to navigate in normal conditions, but become death traps during heavy rainfall." The revelation seemed to surprise Collins, who had assumed her preparation for Special Forces training had focused exclusively on physical conditioning rather than intellectual mastery of the operational environment. "So while we were doing extra reps in the gym," he began,
I was doing extra reps with topographical analysis, Sarah finished for him. Different preparation for different strengths. Physical power has its place, but knowing exactly where to go can sometimes matter more than how fast you get there. The team reached a vantage point that offered a clear view of the valley below, and the sight was sobering. What had been a network of gentle ravines and dry creek beds just hours earlier was now a churning mass of brown water, carrying trees, portions of wooden structures, and other debris. In the middle of this chaos was a small island of relatively higher ground where they could just make out a group of figures huddled around a prone form, Colonel Taylor and his security team, now completely cut off by the rising floodwaters. "Command, this is Team 3. We have visual confirmation of Colonel Taylor's position. He appears to be on an island of high ground completely surrounded by floodwaters. The current is too strong for safe crossing with standard equipment." The response from command was delayed, suggesting they were assessing options for a situation that was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. "Team 3, stand by for helicopter extraction. Air assets are en route to your position, but we're experiencing severe weather delays. Estimated arrival time is 90 minutes, assuming conditions don't worsen." Rivers looked at Sarah, the question obvious in his expression. She shook her head slowly. "That island won't last 90 minutes, she said, pointing to the visibly rising water level and the erosion already eating away at the edges of Colonel Taylor's position. "We need to reach him now and move him to higher ground, where there won't be anyone to extract when the helicopters arrive." The team gathered around the map as Sarah outlined the challenges. The floodwaters were moving too fast for standard crossing techniques.
Swimming was out of the question, and they didn't have enough rope for a Tyrolean traverse across the widest sections. Any attempt to reach the colonel would involve extreme risk. "We need to think beyond conventional approaches," Sarah said, analyzing the terrain with the same methodical precision she'd applied to enemy communication patterns in combat zones. "The water flow is creating a hydraulic pattern that might allow control movement at specific points if we can identify and exploit them." She studied the current patterns, noting how the water flow created relatively calmer sections behind larger obstacles, and how debris was moving through the churning mass. With her knowledge of fluid dynamics, another subject she'd studied while others focused on physical training, she identified a potential approach route that utilized natural breakwaters and countercurrent eddies. "There's a path through the flood," Sarah announced, pointing to specific sections of the raging water. "It's not obvious and it's not safe by any conventional standard, but it's possible with proper technique and timing." Rivers looked skeptical. "You're proposing we try to cross that?" He gestured toward the churning maelstrom that separated them from the colonel. "I'm proposing that I cross it," Sarah corrected. "I weigh less than any of you, which means the current will have less force to work with. I have extensive swift water rescue training, and I understand the hydraulic patterns we're seeing. One person has a chance. A team will just create multiple casualties." The proposal was met with immediate objections from every member of the team. The idea of sending the smallest among them into the most dangerous situation imaginable went against every instinct of the Special Forces community, where looking after your teammates was the highest priority. "It's suicide, Mitchell," Collins said flatly. "No one could make it across that current alive, especially not someone your size." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Size isn't the relevant metric here, Sergeant. It's about understanding the physics of the situation and having the specific skills required to navigate it. In this case, less mass is an advantage, not a liability." Rivers looked from Sarah to the raging floodwaters and back again, clearly wrestling with a decision that could result in losing not just his commanding officer, but also a member of his team. "Command needs to be aware of what we're considering," he said finally, reaching for his radio. "Sir, by the time we debate this through the chain of command, that island will be underwater," Sarah said urgently. "We need to act now or accept that we're going to watch Colonel Taylor die in front of us." The stark assessment hung in the air for a moment before Rivers made his decision. "What do you need from us?" he asked simply. Sarah outlined her plan quickly and efficiently. She would use a lightweight rescue line attached to a harness, allowing the team to provide tension at critical points in the crossing. She would move from one identified safe point to another, using the natural features of the flood to create a manageable path.
If she succeeded in reaching the colonel, she would secure him for extraction once helicopter assets arrived. The key is understanding that water doesn't move uniformly in these conditions, Sarah explained as she prepared her equipment. There are patterns and counterflows that can be utilized if you know how to read them. It's like finding the gaps in enemy surveillance. They're always there if you look carefully enough. The team helped her prepare, securing the rescue line and testing the communication system that would allow her to signal for tension or slack as needed. The plan was unconventional and incredibly dangerous, but it was also their only chance to reach Colonel Taylor before the rising waters claimed his temporary sanctuary. "Mitchell," Collins said as she prepared to begin her crossing, his earlier contempt replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. "That's the craziest plan I've ever heard. It might just work." Sarah gave him a tight smile. "Sometimes the conventional approach isn't the right one, Sergeant. Sometimes you need to change the rules of the game entirely." With those words, she stepped into the edge of the floodwaters, beginning a crossing that would either prove her theories correct or cost her life in the attempt. Behind her, Team 3 took up positions to manage her safety line, their earlier doubts about her capabilities forgotten in the face of her absolute confidence and clear expertise.
The first step into the churning water tested everything Sarah had learned about swift water dynamics. The current pulled at her legs with surprising force, threatening to sweep her away immediately. But she had anticipated this initial shock and positioned herself precisely where a large boulder created a small eddy of relatively calmer water. "It's exactly as I expected," she transmitted to the team. "The hydraulic patterns are holding, beginning movement to point alpha." Sarah moved through the floodwaters with calculated precision, identifying each safe point before committing to movement. The current pulled at her body with relentless force, threatening to sweep her away with each step, but she maintained her focus on the hydraulic patterns she'd identified from shore. Where others would see only chaos, she recognized structure, patterns of flow and counterflow that created momentary opportunities for safe passage. "Tension on the line," she called through her radio as she approached a particularly turbulent section. The team responded immediately, providing the additional support she needed to maintain her position against the strengthening current. From their vantage point on shore, Team 3 watched with a mixture of awe and trepidation as Sarah navigated the raging floodwaters. Her movements were precise and deliberate, each step placed with absolute confidence despite the life-threatening conditions surrounding her. "I've never seen anything like this," Collins muttered, his earlier dismissal of her capabilities completely forgotten. "She's reading that water like it's a book." Rivers nodded, his expression grave. "She's demonstrating a level of environmental awareness that most operators never achieve. While we were judging her for what she couldn't do, we completely missed what she could." Sarah reached a large tree trunk that had become wedged between boulders, creating a small island of relative stability in the churning water. She paused there, catching her breath while studying the next section of her route. The island where Colonel Taylor lay injured was still 30 meters away, and the most dangerous part of the crossing remained ahead. "Command, this is Mitchell. I'm approximately halfway to the Colonel's position. The water is rising faster than anticipated. Request update on helicopter assets." The response crackled through the static. "Mitchell, this is Command. Helicopter assets are still delayed by weather. Earliest arrival now estimated at 2 hours. Be advised, weather radar indicates increased rainfall upstream. Water levels expected to continue rising." Sarah processed this information quickly, adjusting her mental calculations. 2 hours was too long. The island would be completely submerged within 45 minutes at the current rate of water rise. Any rescue plan would need to include moving Colonel Taylor to higher ground rather than simply reaching him and waiting for extraction. "Copy, Command. Continuing mission." She studied the next section carefully. The water here was moving even faster, carrying debris that added an additional layer of danger to the crossing. A misplaced step or moment of inattention could result in being struck by a floating log or swept into one of the numerous submerged obstacles that lurked beneath the surface. "Team 3, I'm going to need slack on the line for this next section. The current patterns require more dynamic movement than the static line allows."
Mitchell, that reduces your safety margin significantly. Are you sure about this approach? Affirmative, sir. The hydraulics here are creating surge patterns that I need to work with rather than against. A static line would actually increase danger in this section. There was a moment of hesitation before Rivers responded. Understood. Proceeding with slackline protocol. Be extremely careful, Mitchell. Sarah unclipped the tension mechanism on her harness, allowing the safety line to feed freely through the system. This gave her the freedom of movement she needed, but also meant that if she lost her footing, the team would have less control over her recovery. She entered the next section of floodwater with calculated confidence, reading the surface patterns that revealed the powerful forces beneath. Where others would see only chaos, she recognized structure, patterns of flow and counterflow that created momentary opportunities for safe passage. "Tension on the line," she called through her radio as she approached a particularly turbulent section. The team responded immediately, providing the additional support she needed to maintain her position against the strengthening current. Halfway through this section, disaster nearly struck.
A massive tree trunk, completely submerged except for a small portion of its upper branches, shot through the water directly toward her position. Sarah spotted the danger just seconds before impact, diving forward into a faster-moving current that carried her beyond the path of the deadly projectile. The maneuver saved her from being struck, but placed her in a more dangerous position within the main channel of the flood. The current here was moving with incredible force, threatening to sweep her downstream and away from her objective. "Mitchell, status," came Rivers' urgent voice over the radio. Sarah fought to maintain her position, using a technique she'd learned from native fishermen during a deployment to Southeast Asia, angling her body to create lift against the current rather than fighting it directly. Still operational, she managed between controlled breaths. "Navigating main channel current, stand by." She spotted a partially submerged boulder, creating a small pocket of calmer water on its downstream side. With precise timing, she allowed the current to carry her toward it, then executed a powerful diagonal stroke that brought her into the protective eddy behind the rock. From this position, she could see Colonel Taylor and his team more clearly. The island of high ground was visibly shrinking as water continued to rise, and the colonel lay immobile on an improvised stretcher while 3 team members huddled around him, their expressions betraying their growing desperation. "Team 3, I have visual confirmation of the colonel's status," Sarah transmitted. "He appears unconscious and immobilized. The remaining high ground will be submerged within 30 minutes. I'm proceeding to final approach." The last section of her journey was the most challenging yet. The channel between her current position and the island was where 2 major water flows converged, creating a churning maelstrom of conflicting currents, dangerous hydraulic boils, and unpredictable surge patterns. Even with her understanding of water dynamics, this crossing would push the boundaries of what was humanly possible. Sarah studied the patterns for a full minute, identifying a sequence of movements that might, with perfect execution and a measure of luck, allow her to reach the island safely. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, but the alternative was watching Colonel Taylor and his team drown while waiting for helicopter assets that would arrive too late. "Team 3, I'm making final approach," she transmitted. "Be prepared to tension the line on my command if I miss the landing point." She took 3 deep, centering breaths, a technique she'd learned from a meditation instructor who specialized in performance under extreme stress. The noise of the raging flood seemed to dim as her focus narrowed to the sequence of movements required for survival. Then she committed. Sarah entered the confluence with deliberate momentum, using her body position to ride the interface between opposing currents. The technique was similar to surfing, but infinitely more complex and dangerous, requiring continuous adjustments to maintain the precarious balance between forces that could drag her under in seconds. For a brief, terrifying moment, she disappeared from the sight of Team 3, submerged by a surge that swept over her position. Rivers reached for the emergency retrieval control on the safety line, but before he could activate it, Sarah reappeared, still moving with purpose toward her objective.
"She's incredible," Collins whispered, watching as she navigated the seemingly impossible crossing with a level of skill that defied conventional understanding. "I've never seen anyone read water like that." The final approach to the island was a desperate lunge through a hydraulic feature that alternated between a dangerous keeper hole and a surging wave. Sarah timed her movement perfectly, catching the surge phase to carry her the last few meters to the edge of the shrinking island. Hands reached out to pull her from the water. Colonel Taylor's security team, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and disbelief that anyone had managed to reach them through the floodwaters that had claimed the lives of 2 would-be rescuers already. "Who the hell are you?" asked the team leader, a master sergeant whose uniform was caked with mud and whose eyes held the haunted look of someone who had accepted his own death. "PFC Sarah Mitchell, Special Forces Selection," she replied, immediately moving toward Colonel Taylor's position. "What's his status?"
"Spinal injury and head trauma," the medic replied, not questioning her authority despite her rank and size. "He's been unconscious for 40 minutes. We've immobilized his neck and spine as best we could, but we need immediate medevac." Sarah assessed the colonel's condition quickly. He was a massive man, easily 6'3" and 220 pounds of solid muscle. His face was pale beneath his tan, and a nasty laceration across his forehead suggested the severity of the impact he'd sustained. "Helicopter assets are delayed by weather," Sarah informed them. "Earliest arrival is 2 hours, and this position will be underwater in less than 30 minutes. We need to move him to higher ground immediately." The team exchanged grim looks. "We tried to move earlier," the master sergeant said. 2 of our men were swept away, attempting to cross a channel that was half as wide and flowing half as fast as what's surrounding us now. With the colonel's injuries, standard movement is impossible." Sarah studied the terrain, her mind calculating distances, elevations, and potential routes. The nearest high ground that would remain above the flood was nearly 800 meters away, an impossible distance to move an injured man through raging floodwaters using conventional methods. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't survived and thrived by relying on conventional methods. "I need to speak to my team," she said, activating her radio. "Captain Rivers, I've reached the colonel. He has suspected spinal injuries and is unconscious. His position will be underwater within 30 minutes, and conventional extraction is impossible given current water levels." "What are our options, Mitchell?" Rivers asked, deferring to her expertise without hesitation, a remarkable shift from just hours earlier when he dismissed her input entirely. "I believe I can create a flotation system using available equipment that would allow controlled movement through specific channels I've identified," Sarah replied. "But it will require coordinated effort from both teams and precise execution of a very unconventional approach." "Lay it out for us," Rivers responded immediately. Sarah outlined her plan quickly and efficiently. Using the equipment available from both teams, she could construct a specialized flotation device that would keep Colonel Taylor immobilized and above water, while allowing a single strong swimmer, herself, to navigate the flood currents using the techniques she had already demonstrated. "The key is working with the water flow rather than against it," Sarah explained. "I've identified a sequence of connected channels that create a viable route to high ground if navigated correctly. It's not a direct path. We'll need to follow the flow patterns and use specific transition points to move between channels." "You're proposing to swim the colonel through floodwaters that have already claimed 2 experienced operators?" the master sergeant asked incredulously. "I'm proposing to navigate those floodwaters using their own energy and flow patterns," Sarah corrected. "It's not about fighting the water. It's about understanding and utilizing its movement." She turned to Rivers over the radio. "Sir, I need your team to proceed to these coordinates." She transmitted specific location data. "That position provides the optimal extraction point from the water flow patterns I've identified. You'll need to establish a recovery system at that location." Rivers acknowledged without questioning her authority on the matter. "Moving to extraction coordinates now. What equipment do you need from our position?" Sarah provided a detailed list of components from both teams' gear that would be required to construct the specialized flotation device. With practice efficiency, she began assembling the system that represented Colonel Taylor's only chance for survival. "Has anyone ever tried something like this before?"
asked the medic as he helped Sarah secure waterproof materials around rigid support elements. "Not that I'm aware of," Sarah admitted. "But the principles are sound. It's an application of fluid dynamics and rescue techniques adapted to these specific conditions." The floating stretcher system took shape under Sarah's direction. A rigid spine board wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof materials with improvised flotation elements strategically positioned to maintain stability in turbulent water. Most importantly, it included guidance fins that would allow Sarah to control their movement through the flood currents with minimal physical force.
"The design works with the water, rather than against it," she explained as they secured the kernel to the device. "These channels will catch specific flow patterns, allowing controlled directional movement without requiring the brute strength that would be impossible against this current." As they completed the preparations, the water continued to rise. What had been a small island was now reduced to a patch of ground barely large enough for the team to stand on. Time was running out. "Everyone clear on their roles?" Sarah asked, receiving nods from Colonel Taylor's security team. 2 would attempt to follow her lead through the floodwaters, while the 3rd would remain on the island to coordinate with incoming helicopter assets if they arrived sooner than expected. Sarah checked the colonel's secure attachment to the flotation system one final time. His massive frame dwarfed her own, making the contrast between rescuer and rescued almost absurd to the casual observer. But as she had demonstrated repeatedly throughout the day, conventional metrics of capability were often misleading. "Team 3, this is Mitchell," she transmitted. "We're commencing water movement now. Estimated arrival at your position in 45 minutes if all goes as planned." "Copy that, Mitchell," came Rivers' response. "Recovery systems in place and standing by." With the island nearly submerged, Sarah guided the flotation system into the floodwaters, immediately engaging the hydraulic features she'd identified during her approach. The colonel's security team members followed, connected by safety lines, but trusting her to navigate the deadly currents. The first channel operated exactly as Sarah had predicted, creating a controlled movement pattern that carried them away from the island and into a complex network of converging flows. She used minimal steering inputs, allowing the water's own energy to do most of the work, while she focused on maintaining optimal position within the flow. "It's working," called one of the team members in amazement as they moved through the raging flood with surprising control. "How did you know this was possible?" "Water always follows predictable patterns, even in chaotic conditions," Sarah replied, making a subtle adjustment to their trajectory as they approached a critical transition point. "Most people only see the danger, but I see the structure beneath the chaos." The journey through the floodwaters was a masterclass in environmental reading and tactical adaptation. Sarah navigated from one flow pattern to another, using natural features to transition between channels when necessary, and constantly adjusting their position to maintain optimal movement. At particularly challenging points, she would call out specific instructions to the team members following her lead. "Angle left here to catch the countercurrent," or "Prepare for turbulence as we cross this hydraulic drop." Her commands were clear, confident, and unfailingly accurate, demonstrating a level of expertise that transcended formal training. Halfway through their journey, they encountered a section where 2 major water flows converged, creating a churning maelstrom that threatened to tear apart their carefully constructed flotation system. Sarah studied the patterns for several seconds before identifying the solution. "We need to submerge slightly at the convergence point," she called to the team. "The calmer water is running about 2 feet below the surface turbulence." It was counterintuitive advice. Deliberately going underwater in flood conditions contradicted every standard rescue protocol. But the security team members, having witnessed Sarah's uncanny ability to read the water, followed her instructions without hesitation. The maneuver worked perfectly. By dropping just below the surface chaos, they passed through the convergence zone with minimal disruption, emerging on the other side into a more manageable flow pattern that carried them toward the extraction point where Team 3 waited. As they approached the final section of their journey, Sarah could see Captain Rivers and his team on the high ground ahead, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and admiration as they watched the improbable rescue unfold. The recovery systems were in place, ropes, pulleys, and manpower
positioned to assist in the final extraction from the floodwaters. Team 3, this is Mitchell.
Approaching extraction point from the southeast channel. Be prepared for rapid recovery on my mark. The final approach required perfect timing. The channel they were following terminated in a hydraulic feature that could either propel them toward the extraction point or trap them in a recirculating current from which escape would be nearly impossible. Sarah studied the pattern, calculating flow rates and timing with the same precision she'd applied to enemy movement patterns in combat zones. On my mark, she called to both teams. 3, 2, 1, mark. The flotation system shot forward on a surge of water as Sarah engaged the final flow pattern. Simultaneously, Team 3 deployed their recovery lines, creating a web of safety connections that intersected perfectly with the Colonel's trajectory. The security team members were pulled from the water first, then helped establish the stable platform needed to extract Colonel Taylor without exacerbating his injuries. With careful coordination between both teams, they lifted the flotation system clear of the floodwaters and onto stable ground. Sarah was the last to exit the flood, pulling herself onto the muddy bank with arms that trembled from the sustained effort of navigating the treacherous waters. For a moment, she simply lay there, breathing heavily as the full magnitude of what she'd accomplished began to register. Captain Rivers extended his hand to help her to her feet, his expression conveying what words could not: complete reassessment of everything he'd previously believed about capability, strength, and what made an exceptional operator. "Mitchell," he said simply, "that was the most extraordinary display of tactical problem-solving I've ever witnessed." Before Sarah could respond, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from command. "All teams, be advised, helicopter medevac is inbound to your position. ETA 5 minutes. Prepare the Colonel for immediate extraction." The medical team immediately went to work, ensuring Colonel Taylor was properly prepared for air transport. His vital signs had remained stable throughout the water journey, a testament to the effectiveness of Sarah's improvised flotation system and the care with which she'd navigated the floodwaters. As the distant sound of helicopter rotors became audible over the roar of the flood, Staff Sergeant Collins approached Sarah, his earlier contempt replaced by unmistakable respect. "I owe you an apology, Mitchell," he said quietly. "I judged you by standards that didn't matter and missed the capabilities that did. What you just accomplished, I couldn't have done it. None of us could have." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Different operators have different strengths, Sergeant. The most effective teams recognize and utilize those differences rather than expecting everyone to excel in the same areas." The helicopter appeared through the rain clouds, its powerful spotlight scanning the ground for the extraction point. As the medical team made final preparations to move Colonel Taylor, his eyes fluttered open for the first time since his injury. What happened?" he managed weakly, looking up at the faces surrounding him. Captain Rivers knelt beside him. "You took a bad fall, sir. PFC Mitchell navigated through floodwaters to reach you and then guided your transport to safety through conditions that had already claimed 2 lives." Taylor's eyes, though clouded with pain and confusion, sought and found Sarah's small figure among the larger operators surrounding him. "You carried me through that?" he asked, his voice reflecting the same disbelief that had characterized everyone's initial reaction to her plan. "Not exactly carried, sir," Sarah replied with a small smile. "I navigated you through it. There's a difference." The helicopter landed in a cleared area 50 meters away, its medical crew rushing toward their position with a proper evacuation stretcher. As they prepared to transfer Colonel Taylor, he reached out and grasped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Remember this, Mitchell," he said, his voice suddenly clear and commanding despite his injuries. "This is why we change policies and open doors, because sometimes the person who can save us all doesn't look anything like we expected." 6 weeks had passed since the rescue, and Sarah Mitchell stood at parade rest outside Colonel Taylor's office at Fort Bragg. The floodwaters had long receded, leaving behind a transformed landscape, both physically and institutionally. The Special Forces Selection Course had been temporarily suspended for a comprehensive review of evaluation criteria and training methodologies, with particular focus on how non-traditional capabilities were assessed and valued.
Sarah had spent those weeks in a strange limbo, neither continuing with the selection process nor being dismissed from it. Instead, she'd been assigned to a special project team examining incident reports and operational procedures related to the flood response. The work was interesting but temporary, and today's meeting with Colonel Taylor would determine her future path. "Enter," came the strong voice from inside the office, showing no traces of the injuries that had nearly claimed his life. Sarah stepped into the spacious office, coming to attention in front of the broad mahogany desk where Colonel Taylor sat reviewing documents. He looked up, his expression unreadable beneath the stern professional mask that had made him legendary among Special Forces candidates. "Private First Class Mitchell reporting as ordered, sir." Colonel Taylor studied her for a moment before gesturing to a chair. "Take a seat, Mitchell. This isn't a formal review." Sarah sat, her posture remaining professional despite the more relaxed setting. The colonel had made a remarkable recovery from his injuries, a combination of excellent emergency care and his own exceptional physical condition. The only visible reminder of the incident was a thin scar that ran along his hairline, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. "I've been reviewing your file," Taylor began, tapping a thick folder on his desk. "It makes for interesting reading, especially the contrast between your quantitative assessments and your practical performance evaluations." Sarah remained silent, sensing this was not a moment for unnecessary commentary. "Your physical metrics place you in the bottom quartile of candidates when measured against standard Special Forces benchmarks," Taylor continued, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "Upper body strength, load-bearing capacity, sprint times, all below established thresholds." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "And yet, when faced with a genuine life-or-death situation requiring tactical problem-solving, environmental awareness, and specialized knowledge, you outperformed every operator on the ground, including myself." The colonel rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds, where a new cohort of candidates was running through obstacle courses. "Do you know what the most dangerous threat to military effectiveness is, Mitchell?" "Complacency, sir?" Sarah offered, drawing on standard military wisdom. Taylor shook his head. "Close, but not quite. It's institutional blindness, the inability to recognize valuable capabilities because they don't fit our preconceived notions of what effectiveness looks like." He turned to face her directly. "We've been selecting for a specific type of operator for decades. Big, strong, physically imposing. And those qualities are valuable in certain contexts. But what happens when the mission doesn't call for brute strength? What happens when success requires different capabilities entirely?" The question hung in the air between them, both knowing that recent events had provided a definitive answer. "Mitchell, I've spent the past 6 weeks thinking about what happened in those floodwaters. Not just the rescue itself, but what it revealed about our selection and training methodologies." Taylor returned to his desk, lifting a document bearing the official seal of the United States Army Special Operations Command. "This is a directive I've just signed, implementing immediate changes to our assessment protocols." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the implications. Changes to Special Forces selection processes typically evolved at glacial speed, with modifications requiring years of committee reviews and field testing before implementation. The new protocols establish parallel assessment tracks that recognize and value different capability profiles. We're moving beyond the one-size-fits-all operator model to something more nuanced and, frankly, more effective for modern warfare. He handed Sarah a separate document, a detailed after-action report from the flood rescue operation. "Your actions that day have already become a case study in adaptive problem-solving and non-conventional tactical approaches."
The question now is what happens with you specifically. Sarah straightened in her chair, preparing herself for whatever decision had been made regarding her future with Special Forces. "Sir, I understand if the physical requirements."
Colonel Taylor raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Mitchell, I'm not interested in what you can't do. I'm interested in what you can do that nobody else can. The former is a limitation we can work around. The latter is an asset we can't afford to waste. He pushed a third document across the desk, official orders bearing her name and a new designation that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. I'm establishing a specialized unit within Special Forces, focused on environmental analysis, tactical innovation, and non-conventional problem-solving. You're being assigned as the developmental lead, working directly with our most experienced operators to formalize the methodologies you employed during the rescue. Sarah stared at the orders in disbelief. Rather than being removed from the selection process, she was being advanced beyond it into a position that hadn't even existed 6 weeks earlier. This isn't charity or special treatment, Taylor added, reading her expression correctly. This is recognition of demonstrated capabilities that proved essential in actual operational conditions. The fact that those capabilities don't align with traditional metrics doesn't make them less valuable, as I can personally attest. The colonel stood, signaling the formal portion of their meeting was concluded. Report to Building 47 tomorrow at 0800. You'll be working with a team of senior operators to develop training modules based on your approach to the flood rescue. They've been informed that regardless of rank, you're the subject matter expert when it comes to environmental analysis and adaptive problem solving. As Sarah prepared to leave, Taylor added one final comment. You know, Mitchell, when they pulled me onto that helicopter, I was still pretty out of it. But I remember thinking something that didn't fully register until later. The biggest person in that entire scenario was the smallest one physically.
The presentation continued with detailed case studies from recent operations where specialized knowledge and non-conventional approaches had proven decisive. With each example, the skepticism in the room noticeably diminished, replaced by the professional curiosity that characterized elite operators when presented with genuinely valuable tactical innovations. After the formal presentation concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by senior operators asking detailed questions about specific aspects of her methodology. The conversation was technical and focused, completely devoid of the gender-based dismissal or size-related jokes that had defined her early experiences in the selection process. Your environmental reading techniques would have saved lives during our operation in the Hindu Kush, commented a grizzled master sergeant with multiple combat tours. We lost 2 men trying to cross terrain that looked passable, but contained hidden dangers we couldn't identify. That's exactly the scenario these protocols are designed to address, Sarah replied. The indicators are always present if you know what to look for, but they're often subtle and require specialized knowledge to interpret correctly. As the discussion continued, Sarah became aware of Colonel Taylor beckoning her to join him and several high-ranking officers who had attended the presentation. She excused herself from the technical conversation and made her way to the colonel's position. Mitchell, these gentlemen are from JSOC headquarters, Taylor said, referring to the Joint Special Operations Command that oversaw the military's most elite units. They're interested in implementing aspects of your program across multiple special operations components. The senior officer extended his hand. That was impressive, Mitchell. We've been wrestling with these capability gaps for years without a coherent framework for addressing them. Your approach offers a structured methodology we can actually implement. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. The framework is still evolving as we incorporate feedback from field trials. That's precisely why we want you to present at the Joint Operations Symposium next month, he said. This isn't just relevant to Army Special Forces. It has applications across the entire special operations community.
The invitation to present at the military's most prestigious Special Operations Conference represented a level of professional recognition that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Sarah had gone from being dismissed as too small for real operational roles to being recognized as a pioneer in tactical methodology. As the senior officers moved on to other conversations, Colonel Taylor remained behind, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Mitchell, when I approved the policy change allowing women to attempt Special Forces qualification, I did it because it was the right thing to do in principle, but I didn't actually expect it to transform our operational capabilities in practice." "The transformation isn't about gender, sir," Sarah replied. "It's about recognizing that different types of missions require different types of capabilities, and that traditional metrics don't always identify the most valuable operators for specific contexts." Taylor nodded. "That's true, but it took someone who didn't fit the traditional mold to make us see it clearly. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from the person who has to find alternative approaches because the standard path isn't available to them." Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in her office, reviewing data from the latest field trials of her environmental analysis protocols. The new methodologies were showing promising results, with test teams demonstrating significantly improved performance in complex terrain assessment and tactical adaptation. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. She looked up to see Staff Sergeant Collins, the same man who had once called her tiny and suggested she belonged at a desk rather than in operational roles. "Got a minute, Mitchell?" he asked, his demeanor notably different from their early interactions during selection. "Of course, Sergeant. What can I do for you?" Collins took a seat across from her desk, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've been implementing your protocols with my training group, and we're seeing impressive results.
But I'm having trouble with the environmental reading module, specifically getting the candidates to recognize subtle indicators in complex terrain." Sarah nodded, understanding the challenge immediately. It's a different kind of observation than most operators are trained to develop. They're looking for human threats and tactical positions rather than environmental patterns. "Exactly," Collins agreed. "And I thought, who better to help refine the training approach than the person who developed the methodology in the first place?" The request for assistance from someone who had once dismissed her capabilities entirely represented the ultimate vindication of Sarah's approach. Collins wasn't seeing her as a woman or as someone physically smaller than the typical operator. He was seeing her as a subject matter expert with valuable knowledge to share. "I'd be happy to work with your team," Sarah replied. "Maybe we can develop some progressive training scenarios that bridge the gap between conventional tactical observation and environmental pattern recognition." Collins nodded, then hesitated before adding, "I owe you another apology, Mitchell, not just for how I treated you during selection, but for how long it took me to recognize what you were really bringing to the table." Sarah considered his words carefully before responding. "Sergeant, the entire institution was structured to value certain capabilities and discount others. Individual attitudes were just reflections of the broader system. What matters is that we're building something better now." "Still," Collins insisted, "I judged you on what you weren't instead of what you were. And in doing so, I almost missed the most innovative tactical thinker I've encountered in 15 years of special operations." His acknowledgement wasn't just personal validation. It represented the institutional transformation that Sarah's experience had catalyzed. The military's most elite units were beginning to recognize that capability came in many forms, and that the most effective teams leveraged diverse skill sets rather than enforcing standardized profiles. 6 months after the flood rescue, Sarah stood at the edge of a training ground, watching a new cohort of Special Forces candidates navigating an environmental analysis course she had designed. Among them were men and women of varying physical sizes and strengths, each being evaluated on their specific capability profiles rather than against identical metrics. Colonel Taylor joined her at the observation point. Both of them watching as a particularly small female candidate demonstrated exceptional terrain reading and tactical adaptation during a complex problem-solving scenario. "She reminds me of someone," Taylor commented with a slight smile. "She has good instincts,"
Sarah acknowledged. But more importantly, she's being given the opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that would have been overlooked in the old system. Taylor nodded thoughtfully. You know, Mitchell, military institutions don't change easily or quickly. It usually takes generational turnover or catastrophic failure to shift entrenched methodologies. Or a 6'3" commander getting carried through floodwaters by someone half his size, Sarah added with a respectful smile. Taylor laughed, a rare sound from the normally stoic officer. Exactly. Sometimes the most effective catalyst for change is a demonstration that makes the necessary shift undeniable. They watched as the candidates completed the scenario, each utilizing different approaches based on their individual capabilities and perspectives. The resulting team performance was noticeably superior to what traditional selection methods had produced, a tangible validation of the new methodology. What you've built here goes beyond Special Forces, Taylor said after a moment. This approach to capability assessment and team composition has applications across the entire military. That wasn't my initial goal, Sarah admitted. I just wanted the opportunity to serve in a role where my specific capabilities could make a difference. And in pursuing that goal, you've transformed how we think about operational effectiveness. That's how lasting change often happens, not from grand institutional initiatives, but from individuals refusing to accept artificial limitations on their contributions. As the sun began to set over the training grounds, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point.
From being dismissed as too small for meaningful operational roles, to pioneering methodologies that were reshaping the military's most elite units, all because she had refused to accept that physical size determined capability. The transformation wasn't just about military effectiveness, though that had been the catalyst. It was about recognizing that human potential comes in countless variations, and that institutions are strongest when they develop systems to identify and leverage diverse capabilities rather than forcing everyone into identical molds. They used to laugh at your size, Taylor observed, echoing her thoughts. Now they study your methodologies at the War College. I'd call that a pretty effective response to being underestimated. Sarah smiled. The best response to being underestimated isn't resentment or resignation, it's excellence. When you demonstrate undeniable capability, you don't just change perceptions about yourself, you change the standards by which capability itself is measured. As they turned to leave, Taylor added one final thought. You know, Mitchell, the greatest strength you brought to that flood rescue wasn't physical at all. It was the courage to trust your own assessment even when everyone else dismissed it. That's the quality we should have been measuring all along. The following day, Sarah would brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on implementing her methodologies across all special operations components, institutional recognition at the highest level. But in that moment, watching new candidates benefit from pathways that hadn't existed for her, she realized that the most meaningful validation wasn't in formal recognition, but in systemic change that opened doors for others. Sometimes the most profound impact comes not from fitting perfectly into existing systems, but from having the courage to demonstrate that the systems themselves need to change. Proving through undeniable excellence that capability takes many forms and that the most valuable assets aren't always the most obvious ones.